Welcome to your personalized deep dive. This time, we're going to take a good look at European salary trends for 2024.
Excited to break it all down.
We know you're particularly interested in Amsterdam and Berlin, right?
Yes. Two of Europe's most dynamic cities.
Exactly. And how those cities' salary trends stack up against other major European hubs.
Should be some fascinating insights there.
Now, for today's deep dive, we're drawing on a really comprehensive report.
Okay, fill me in. Which one?
This one's from talentup.io.
Oh, yeah, they're one of the leading salary data platforms over in Europe. I've seen their stuff. They go deep.
Absolutely. They analyze a huge amount of data.
Like, how huge are we talking?
They cover something like over 8 million companies.
Wow, that's massive.
More than 200 cities, too.
Okay, so they've pretty much got the whole European landscape covered then.
Pretty much. And their methodology is really solid.
Yeah, I've always found their data to be pretty reliable. What's their process like?
They pull data from all sorts of places. Job postings, professional profiles,
Yeah.
even company reviews.
Oh, interesting. So they're getting a good mix of sources there.
Yep. And then they have this whole rigorous process to clean it up and make sure it's accurate.
So we can trust that we're working with solid numbers then.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that really caught our eye in the report was this quote from the CEO of talentup.io, Jordi Arcus. He's talking about, and I quote, a dramatic shift in income trends.
A dramatic shift. Okay, I'm all ears.
And he points out some of the key drivers of this shift, like, of course, inflation and the rise of remote work and, those constantly changing skill demands.
Yeah. It's definitely a dynamic time to be working, that's for sure. But I guess let's start with that inflation piece, since that's always a hot topic.
Always. Especially when it comes to paychecks, right?
Absolutely. It's that sneaky thing. Inflation, it erodes your purchasing power over time.
It's almost like a silent thief, chipping away at your earnings.
Exactly. So even if your salary stays the same on paper, if the prices of goods and services are going up,
Your money doesn't go as far.
right, you're effectively earning less even though the number on your paycheck hasn't changed.
Right. So how bad is it, really? What's the current inflation situation like in Europe?
Well, looking at the numbers, the average inflation rate in the Eurozone for the first half of 2024 was about 4.3%.
4.3%. Okay. That's pretty significant.
Definitely. And to put that in context, the European Central Bank, the ECB, their target rate is 2%.
Wow, so it's more than double their target.
Yep. Definitely a cause for concern.
What's fueling this high inflation, though? It can't just be one thing, right?
No, it's definitely a combination of factors.
Like what?
Well, for one, we're still seeing some of those lingering supply chain issues,
Yeah.
Stemming from the pandemic.
Yeah, those are still having a ripple effect, aren't they?
Definitely. And then on top of that, we have the whole volatility in energy prices.
Right. Energy prices have been all over the place.
Totally. And that's heavily influenced by the situation in Ukraine, of course.
Right, the war. That's added another layer of complexity to the whole global energy market.
Exactly. And of course, the ongoing war itself just adds to the general economic uncertainty. Businesses get nervous, consumers get nervous.
And prices go up.
It's a bit of a domino effect, unfortunately.
The report also mentioned the ECB and its role in all this.
Ah, yes, the ECB, the guardians of the euro.
So what exactly is their approach to trying to manage this inflation beast?
They use what are called monetary policies to try and keep things in check.
And what are some examples of those?
Well, one of their key tools is adjusting interest rates.
Interest rates. Okay.
Yeah.
How does that work?
The idea is if they make borrowing more expensive, it can potentially cool down the economy a bit, slow down those price increases.
So it's like taking the foot off the gas pedal a little.
Yeah, kind of like that. But of course, it's not quite as simple as that. It's a delicate balance.
I was just thinking that. What are some of the potential downsides to messing with those interest rates?
Well, raising interest rates too aggressively, that could backfire big time.
In what way?
It might bring inflation down in the short term, but it could also stifle economic growth overall.
Yeah. Left growth means fewer jobs, maybe even lower wages.
Exactly. And that's definitely not what anyone wants.
So it's a bit of a tightrope walk for them, isn't it?
Totally. They have to balance inflation control with keeping the economy healthy.
It's a tough job. What I find interesting is that the relationship between inflation and wages, it's not the same everywhere in Europe.
Yeah, you're right. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Different countries are responding in different ways.
They are. And a lot of that comes down to things like the strength of their trade unions.
Okay, right. The power of collective bargaining.
Exactly. And also the structure of those wage negotiations, how they're set up in each country.
So in some places, wages are more likely to keep up with inflation than others?
Exactly. Take those Scandinavian countries, for example. Strong unions, centralized wage bargaining.
They've got a good system for making sure workers keep pace.
Yeah. It's like having a really powerful advocate at the negotiating table, fighting for your best
A
interests.
powerful advocate. That's a
Yeah.
good way to put it. But what about countries where unions aren't as prominent? Do wages tend to lag behind more there?
Well, in those cases, workers might not have the same bargaining power, so yeah, as prices rise, their wages might not keep up, especially if the labor market in that country is more fragmented.
Hmm, makes sense. Now, with all this talk about inflation and wages and purchasing power,
Getting to the real heart of the matter, yeah.
are people's earnings actually keeping up with that rising cost of living? That's the big question, right?
It is. And it's a question with a complex answer, unfortunately. Now, Eurostat reported that average nominal wage growth in the Eurozone was around 4.1% in the first quarter of 2024.
Okay, 4.1%. So at first glance, that sounds not too bad, actually.
You'd think so, right? But that's where we need to make a distinction between nominal wage growth and real wage growth.
Ah, okay, there's a difference. What's the difference between those two?
So that 4.1% figure, that's the nominal growth,
Nominal.
which means it hasn't been adjusted for inflation.
Oh, I see.
So when you factor in that 4.3% inflation rate we talked about,
The real wage growth,
is only around 0.7%.
0.7%. Wow. So even though paychecks might be going up a little?
In reality, most workers are actually seeing their purchasing power decrease.
So they're losing ground, even though it might not look like it at first?
Sadly, yeah, they're not keeping up with those rising costs for all those everyday things. Groceries, rent, you name it.
Now, I know we have a listener who's particularly interested in Amsterdam and Berlin.
Right, let's zoom in on those cities, see what's happening there specifically.
I'd love to hear about Berlin first, if we could.
Sure, well, Berlin's actually a bit of a standout in Europe right now, according to this report.
Okay, in what way?
They've seen a pretty significant wage increase.
Oh, really? How significant?
We're talking 17.48%.
17.48%. Okay, that is significant.
And all that against a relatively low inflation rate of 2.3%.
Wow. So they're way ahead of the curve there. What do you think is driving that kind of wage growth in Berlin specifically?
It's probably a mix of factors, but one big one is likely their booming tech scene.
Berlin's tech scene, yeah.
It's really taken off in the last few years, attracting talent, investment. You know, that competitive job market pushes wages up.
Makes sense. Everyone wants those tech skills, so companies have to pay up to get them.
Exactly. And Berlin also has a strong labor union presence, which, as we know, can really help in securing better wages for workers.
So a combination of a hot job market and strong worker protections.
Yeah.
Sounds like a good recipe for wage growth.
It seems to be working for them.
Oh, okay, so Berlin's looking good. What's the picture like over in Amsterdam?
Amsterdam's a bit different.
Ah,
The report shows virtually no change in salary levels there.
really? So no growth at all?
Pretty much. We're talking a flat 0.00% increase.
Wow, that's surprising. Any ideas why Amsterdam's salary trends might be stagnating like that?
It's hard to say for sure, but a few things come to mind.
Like what?
It could be a sign of market saturation, maybe?
Market saturation, okay. Meaning,
Like maybe the supply of talent there is exceeding the demand.
oh, I see. So there's lots of people competing for those jobs, so wages stay flat.
That could be part of it. Or it could be that salaries in Amsterdam were already at a pretty high benchmark to begin with.
So there's not much room for them to go up further.
Exactly. It's kind of like they hit a ceiling.
Interesting. So we've got Berlin booming and Amsterdam at a standstill.
Yeah, quite a contrast.
Are there any other cities that stand out in terms of how their wages are doing against inflation?
Well, Barcelona and Madrid offer an interesting comparison, I think.
Okay, tell me more.
They saw a salary increase of 3.87%,
3.87%.
and that's against an inflation rate of 2.8%.
So they're outpacing inflation at least.
Yeah, but just by a small margin.
So a slight improvement in real wages for those cities. Yeah. But I imagine these are all just averages.
Oh, of course.
The actual impact on individuals can vary a lot, depending on their job, their industry, even their location within a city.
Definitely. And that brings us to another important point. Those regional disparities we see in how inflation is affecting wages across Europe.
Regional disparities. Okay, so we need to zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture.
Exactly.
I'm intrigued. Let's delve into those regional differences and how they're shaping the overall European salary landscape.
Let's do it. So yeah, these regional differences are pretty fascinating when you start to dig into them.
Yeah, let's zoom out a bit. Look at that bigger picture you were talking about.
Yeah.
What are some of the key regional trends that you're seeing?
Well, one of the things that really jumps out from the report is that Eastern Europe is having a rough time with these inflationary pressures.
Yeah, I can imagine. Why do you think Eastern Europe is being hit harder than other parts of Europe?
I think it's a combination of factors. They just face some economic vulnerabilities that make them more susceptible to these global price fluctuations.
Okay, like what kind of vulnerabilities?
Well, for one, they tend to be more reliant on energy imports than some other regions.
Ah, yeah. So when energy prices spike globally, they really feel it.
Exactly. And their economies also tend to be less diversified compared to some of their Western counterparts.
So they don't have as many different industries to kind of cushion the blow when things get tough.
Exactly. So when you combine those factors with global events like the war in Ukraine, it creates a perfect storm for rising prices.
And I'm guessing that translates to a pretty significant erosion of purchasing power for workers in those countries.
Unfortunately, yeah, they're seeing their wages just not keeping up with the rapid pace of inflation, and that leads to real economic hardship for a lot of people.
We've been talking a lot about the challenges. What about any bright spots? Are there any positive trends emerging in Eastern Europe that you've observed in the report?
That's a great question. It's always important to look for those glimmers of hope, even in tough situations. And the report does highlight some positive developments, particularly in countries like Poland and Romania.
Okay. What's looking up in those countries?
Well, certain sectors are showing some promising growth.
Hmm.
For instance, the IT and outsourcing industries in those countries are attracting a lot of foreign investment.
So they're creating new job opportunities.
Yeah, and often with competitive salaries too. So even within a region facing significant challenges, there are pockets of opportunity and growth, particularly in sectors aligned with global trends and demands.
So for those with the right skills, there's still a chance to thrive even in a challenging economic environment.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about Eastern Europe. What about Western Europe? How are they navigating this inflationary storm?
Yeah, Western Europe seems to be doing a bit better overall, right?
Generally, yes. They've experienced more stable inflation rates. They're not completely immune to these global pressures, of course, but countries like Germany and France seem to be weathering the storm better than some others.
I guess those strong labor market institutions and social safety nets they've built up over time are helping.
Definitely. Those support systems act as a kind of buffer, helping to absorb some of the economic shocks.
It's like having a safety net to catch you if you fall.
Exactly. Now, speaking of Germany, we talked about Berlin's impressive wage growth earlier.
Yeah, 17.48%. It's hard to forget that number.
Exactly. So is that a reflection of a broader trend across the country?
That's what I'm wondering. Is Germany as a whole seeing strong wage growth?
It seems so. Wages have been growing consistently there, especially in sectors with a strong union presence, like we've been discussing. That collective bargaining power really makes a difference.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that workers have more leverage when they stand together.
Absolutely. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Southern Europe. Are they experiencing similar challenges to what we're seeing in Eastern Europe?
It's a good question. They're often grouped together as facing similar economic issues. So I'm curious to hear what the report has to say about Southern Europe.
Well, Southern Europe, particularly countries like Italy, Spain, and Greece, they face their own unique set of hurdles.
In what way?
Well, they were already grappling with some economic challenges even before this wave of inflation hit.
Like what kinds of challenges?
Things like high public debt, slow growth, it's a tough combination. And it makes it even harder for them to adapt and recover when faced with these global economic shocks.
So they're starting from a more vulnerable position. How is that impacting wages in those countries?
Unfortunately, wage growth in Southern Europe has often lagged behind inflation, and that just adds fuel to the fire of existing economic inequalities.
So it's not just about the cost of living going up, it's also about the gap between the rich and the poor widening.
Exactly. You see higher levels of economic insecurity in these countries, particularly among younger workers and those in lower skilled jobs.
It's a worrying trend for sure. And it highlights how this isn't just an economic issue. It has social and political implications too.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about regional differences now. What about industry differences? You mentioned earlier that the sector you work in can really impact how you experience these economic shifts. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point to make. It's not just about where you live. It's also about what you do for a living.
Yeah.
Let's break down those sectoral differences and how they play into this whole salary equation.
Okay, let's think about it this way. Inflation affects different sectors differently depending on the demand for their products or services. So, in high demand sectors like technology, finance, healthcare, these companies are in constant competition to attract and retain those skilled workers.
So it's almost like a seller's market for talent in those sectors.
Exactly. They have more leverage to negotiate better salaries because companies need their skills.
It makes sense. What are some examples from the report that highlight this trend?
Sure. The report shows that in the tech sector, Ireland and Germany are seeing significant wage growth as companies compete for those in-demand tech skills.
Yeah, it's like we're seeing a mini Silicon Valley emerging in parts of Europe.
Kind of. It's not just tech, though. Finance is another sector seeing strong wage growth, particularly in major financial hubs like London, Frankfurt, Paris. The demand for specialized skills in areas like investment banking, asset management, fintech, it's fueling those higher salaries.
So if you've got those specialized tech or finance skills, you're probably navigating this economic climate a bit better than others, at least when it comes to salary. But what about the other side of the coin? What about those industries facing less demand, like retail, hospitality, public services? How are they dealing with these economic headwinds?
Unfortunately, those sectors are facing a very different reality.
Yeah, I was thinking that they're not exactly known for having high salaries to begin with.
Exactly. And in those industries, wages tend to be lower. There's often a higher proportion of part-time or temporary work. And workers in these sectors might also have weaker union representation.
So they don't have as much bargaining power when it comes to negotiating for higher pay.
Exactly. So you combine all those factors, and you have a situation where wage growth is slower and often lags behind inflation.
So they're being squeezed from both sides. Lower wages and rising prices. It's a tough spot to be in.
It is. And the report highlights some pretty stark examples.
Like what?
Well, take retail, for instance. The shift to online shopping, coupled with inflation squeezing consumer spending, has really hit retailers hard.
Yeah, their profit margins aren't what they used to be.
Exactly. So it's hard for them to offer substantial wage increases even if they wanted to.
It's understandable that businesses are facing their own pressures too, but it still leaves those retail workers in a difficult position. What about hospitality? How are they holding up?
Hospitality is another sector that's been really struggling. They were hit hard by the pandemic, and now they're facing these added economic pressures. A lot of businesses in this sector are still trying to recover. They're operating on thin margins, facing rising costs. It's just really tough for them to offer competitive wages in this kind of environment.
It sounds like workers in these sectors are bearing the brunt of inflation with limited options to negotiate for better pay. It really highlights that stark contrast between those thriving in the high-demand sectors and those struggling in industries facing multiple challenges.
You said it. And it underscores the point that the impact of inflation on wages isn't a one-size-fits-all story. It's highly dependent on your location, your industry, your skills, a whole host of other factors.
It's like a complex web of interconnected forces shaping the salary landscape.
Exactly. And with remote work blurring those geographical boundaries, it makes you wonder if those lines will become even more blurred in the future.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thought. Could we see a convergence of salaries across Europe as companies compete for talent regardless of location?
It's certainly a possibility worth considering. Remote work has the potential to level the playing field in some ways. It allows companies to tap into talent pools that were previously inaccessible, and it gives employees more flexibility and options.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity to an already dynamic landscape. I'm already thinking about our next deep dive and how we can explore these future trends. But for now, let's bring this conversation back to our listener.
Sounds good.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into European salary trends, what's the key takeaway you'd like our listener to walk away with today?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the impact of inflation on wages, well, it's not a simple story. It's super complex, lots of different factors at play.
It's definitely not one size fits all.
Nope, not at all. You can't just look at the overall inflation rate and assume everyone's being affected the same way.
Right, because like we've been discussing, it really depends on where you are, what industry you're in, what specific skills you have.
Exactly. It's like we're seeing a tale of two Europes emerging, almost.
A tale of two Europes.
Yeah, like on one hand, you have those folks in high demand sectors, those who are in those economically stable countries. They're doing all right.
They're weathering the storm, at least.
They are. But then you have those in struggling industries or those in regions that are getting hit harder by inflation. And, well, it's a different story for them.
Yeah, it's a much tougher road for them, for sure.
It is. And it makes you think about the future, right? With all these trends we've talked about, like remote work.
Oh, yeah. Remote work is changing the game in so many ways.
Totally. It makes you wonder if we might see a convergence of salaries across Europe as this trend continues.
Convergence. So, like,
Yeah.
those Silicon Valley level salaries spreading out across the continent.
Potentially, yeah. As companies compete for talent and location becomes less of a factor, those salary differences might start to shrink.
Huh. That's a really interesting thought. I'd love to explore that more in a future deep dive, actually. But for now, if our listener wants to get into the nitty-gritty, see what specific salaries look like for different roles in cities,
Mm-hmm.
what would you recommend?
Talentup.io is the place to go. Their platform is fantastic. They have super detailed salary data broken down by all sorts of factors. Really useful stuff.
It's great that resources like that exist. Knowledge is power, as they say, especially when it comes to navigating your career in these crazy times.
Couldn't agree more. Staying informed is key.
Well, on that note, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into European salary trends for 2024. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.